Gavin Williamson, the former education minister, the man with the spider, has been up in arms about the Labour government's suspension of a free speech bill which was about to become an act and was about to go into law. And, well, anything that Gavin Williams proposes, I think one should probably sneer at. But the recent decision by the Labour government to pause and potentially revoke this Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act just before it was due to be enacted, just before it was due to become law, has sparked some debate. The act, which was introduced by the last government, aimed to strengthen the right to free speech and academic freedom on university campuses by imposing duties on institutions and their student unions to promote free speech rather than suspend it. But of course, that may not necessarily be exactly what it was intended to do, and it may not be exactly how it would be understood. The Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, has suggested that the act was, quote, disproportionate, burdensome and damaging to student welfare, without adequately addressing hate speech on campuses. She emphasised the need to shift the focus of the Office for Students towards ensuring the financial stability of the higher education sector rather than entangling it in contentious free speech issues. So from her point of view, the free speech concern is an irrelevance. And she may be right. Gavin Williamson, a proponent of the Act, has criticised the revocation, saying that it undermines free and wide-ranging debate in higher education. Well, I would have thought he probably had already done that. He pointed to a continuous erosion of free speech in universities over the past decades, during which time he had been the education minister, and he highlighted cases where academics were allegedly silenced or cancelled for their views, such as Kathleen Stock or Heather Brunskill Evans. He's quite right. But in the Free Speech Union, Toby Young, the founder of the Free Speech Union, has condemned the government's move as an attack on free speech, threatening legal action. The Free Speech Union views this legislation as crucial to protecting academic freedom against a perceived crisis in universities where dissenting voices are allegedly stifled, where people are cancelled, where communities and debate is cancelled. Groups representing Jewish students have expressed support for the government's decision, concerned that the act might inadvertently allow anti-Semitic extremists access to campuses, and this highlights the complex balance between protecting free speech and ensuring the safety and well-being of minority groups. The concept of free speech is fundamentally about the right to express ideas and opinions without censorship or restraint. However, the modern discourse often involves the challenge of balancing this right with the need to protect individuals and groups from hate speech and from harmful ideology. Free speech should ideally include diverse and opposing viewpoints, fostering a robust intellectual environment. Yet the speech that is often branded as free can also degenerate into hate speech. It can incite violence, discrimination, and that poses a significant challenge for any democratic government. The difficulty lies in defining the boundary between protected speech and harmful rhetoric. And academic freedom is a subset of free speech, specifically within the context of higher education. It allows scholars to research, teach, and discuss ideas without interference or fear of retribution. The Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act was an attempt to enshrine this concept within a legal framework and protect controversial and minority viewpoints. But it was badly worded, I suspect. And there's a concern that the term free speech can be co-opted to promote specific ideology. And Conservatives have recently championed free speech to counter what they see as liberal dominance in academia that stifles right-wing perspectives. Conversely, progressives have advocated for restrictions on speech that they believe perpetuates inequality and harm, such as hate speech. The debate on free speech also risks descending into propaganda, where each side uses the rhetoric of free speech to advance their own agenda and suppress any dissent. So, for example, policies purportedly protecting free speech might selectively benefit this viewpoint while marginalizing that viewpoint, undermining the principle of a truly open and free discourse. I think the wording of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act is vague enough to cause confusion, and is certainly a result of a series of very woolly and rather ineffective education ministers from the last Conservative government, starting with people like Gavin Williamson. So I'm not surprised that Gavin Williamson is protesting, because he is exposed. It's as if he's been walking around with his trousers around his ankles. This is the very confusing text of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act is the problem. And when one word in a legal document can have two meanings, that document itself becomes pointless. You can't assume a meaning in law. So when challenged in courts, it becomes pointless. And that fundamentally is the problem with that act. So from that point of view, I think it's right to pause the act going into actual circulation. But the principle behind the act is something that needs to be encouraged. So this is a piece of legislation that probably needs to be tinkered with and redrafted, but must go out. The preservation of freedom of speech is an essential, but it needs to be defined and codified, put into decent legal language by people who have a brain. And the constant revolving door of idiocy, well, has that finished? No, I'm afraid it hasn't, because it's inbuilt into ministerial ambition. And we need to have real professionals working on the development of these laws, people who understand the legal framework and people who understand the educational purpose. Without the freedom to debate, there can be no education. Education is leading people into the light, into the freedom. It's a development of the image of the cave from Plato. People are dragged up or led up. It's a process of invitation and compulsion. People are compelled. It's not something one willingly does. But once one realizes where one's going, yes, one grabs the opportunity. But that involves the option of then being trusted. And the Freedom of Speech Act doesn't deal with trust. And restoring trust to education at all its levels, not just at higher education, not just in universities, at all its levels, is a fundamental necessity. Without that trust built into the education system, we cannot have a trustworthy education in this country. One way is to demonstrate trust, and I think that's to encourage more exams, more public exams, to be marked and judged by the teachers in schools. Whether this is a matter of individual schools marking their own homework effectively, or whether this is a matter of schools bonding together in little groups and pooling resources. This would also help to spread standards, not only between private and state schools, but also between schools which are better performing and schools that are not so well performing, this would be a great positive. From primary school up to secondary school, whether A-levels ultimately need to be marked independently by a board is another matter, but everything up to GCSE can be marked locally by schools or by groups of schools, and that would provide maybe a further source of income and a further motivation for teachers during the summer holidays, and or indeed those exams could take place earlier. But you know, the whole exam system needs to be questioned, and we need to put the trust in the schools, and we need to do the same thing with universities. Universities already have a sort of pooling process when it comes to marking exams, and that process should be farmed out to lower down in the educational system. As for universities, we need to recognize that they are a centre for debate, and anything that restricts that debate must be wrong, and anything that restricts research must be wrong. And all we have to do is look across to Russia to see the level of depravity once censorship takes root. And in an age where we have automatic access to texts, to documents through the internet, we can see the internet being stifled from one country to another, and that's absurd. The idea of freedom is the idea of a global freedom, and so the concept of Brexit again flies in the face of the idea of freedom. So we need to make sure that post-Brexit academic freedom and academic discourse is encouraged across the national and international divides.